Good morning guys, girls, dogs and everyone in between. I'm Zarkane and welcome back to my channel. This week I'm going to tackle a broader subject that players of any faction can probably benefit from, but most importantly I'm going to do it from a Genestealer cult's perspective, and that subject is defensive abilities. Of course I'm not talking about our defensive abilities because let's face it, they'll be a very short video, we barely have any. I'm talking about knowing and understanding your opponent's defensive stats and how to deal with them or how to work around them. You see, if you play Genestealer cults like I do, you want to be on the attack constantly. You know, if you sit back with this faction and try to play cagey, you're probably going to get smashed unless you're up against a very slow-moving opponent. You know, they're just going to get you. They're going to make it hard for you to hide. We can't play that defensive game. Our toughness is low. Our armor saves are low. It's not in our nature. If you want to be successful, don't be lured into the trap of trying to play too sneaky, you know, trying to set all these traps and hiding from the enemy. I know that's the Genestealer cult lore, but in reality, these days, you just have to come prepared for a big, nasty brawl. The kind of brawl where unless you get the first punch in, it's probably not going to go your way. Now, when you're on the offensive, you're going to come up against armies on the other end of the spectrum. And the real tough shit, you know, that exists to stand its ground against all kinds of threats. I'm talking like Custodies, Death Guard, Deathwing Terminators, you know, the kings of durability. Fighting against these guys can often be so demoralizing. You can throw shit at them all day and sometimes none of it sticks. That's because they can layer on all these extra defensive buffs that just soak up all the damage. Don't be put off, however, because sometimes all you need to do is land a few blows and their model count quickly dwindles. You know, losing a few expensive units can really hurt. But it's also important to look at other factions too, because these days there's plenty of quirky abilities that can fuck with your game plan. For example, in a tournament I played a few weeks ago, in my first game I was up against Harlequins, probably for the first time since 8th, and they had a surprising amount of unique, clever tricks I'd just totally forgotten about, and it just kept them alive throughout the fight. So we'll look at these two, because it's not just the big chunky Terminator armor boys who can ruin your day. So this video is going to be all about knowing and understanding these defensive mechanics and how to handle them with what the cult has got at its disposal. I'm going to try and keep it newbie friendly, but also deep enough for more experienced players to benefit from it. So let's jump right in with the most common and easy to understand, which I would say is high invulnerable saves. Now, once upon a time, invuln saves were a special rare thing. Now they're just handed out like candy. So for all you newbies, an invuln is a special armor save that cannot be lowered by using armor piercing attacks, or AP as we commonly shorten it to. So for example, your average Space Marine Terminator, it might have a standard armor save of 2+, but its invuln will be 5+. So that means that you can knock the 2+ save back to 5, never any further than that. Now, an invuln of 5 is pretty solid, but things start to get really nasty when you're fighting 4+, or even worse, a 3+. I mean, that's basically like saying no matter what you hit them with, there's a half chance or even a 2/3 chance that they'll just save it, and there's nothing you can do about it. So, to be clear, here's some classic examples. Bulgrin with Brute Shields, they can go up to a 3+ invuln. Custodies, Terminators with Storm Shields, I mean anything with a Storm Shield really. But then there's also smaller, more nimble units with access to it. So Harlequins get 4+ invulns for being so acrobatic and fast. Demons usually have 5+ invulns for being, well, demonic. You know, this is a big problem for the cult because we pay through the nose for our melee weapons like the drills and the swords and the cutters. They're all AP-3 or AP-4, which is amazing. But it's very, very rare these days that you actually get to fully benefit from that. On the days that you do, it's like, fuck, you know, oh my god, this is so good. And you get all that heavy damage in, you know, let's say if you hit a knight or an Imperial Guard tank or something. But the main problem with high invulns is that if you have a low amount of attacks, all the enemy has to do is roll decently, and it's as simple as that. You have to expect the worst to happen because often it probably will. So my recommendation is simple. If you're hitting a high invuln target, you need as many attacks as possible. If you can't beat the save, you've got to overwhelm it. So in this case, I look to the hybrid metamorphs for melee against durable infantry. So equip them with 1 Rending Claw and maybe the Talon if you're feeling saucy as well. I know a lot of people choose the whips. But then you can put Might from Beyond on them. You pay 1 CP for Violence Unleashed, and that's found in the Greater Good book, not the original codex. And that gets your hybrids up to 5 attacks base and the extra Talon attack. Now, the enemy will most likely just not make enough saves. The Rending Claws will get some wounds through at -4 AP on when you do your wound rolls of 6, and that's going to help you knock back the save on Terminators or, you know, similar types of units. You don't have to use Metamorphs. Even just basic Acolytes can get a fair amount of attacks with those basic Rending Claws. Now, when it comes to shooting, the Goliath truck's twin autocannons are a good backup. They've got just enough AP to be useful, they're cheap, and they're 2 flat damage. Sadly, there's not much else in our codex that puts out enough firepower to be useful. Hand flamers are a great way to swamp the enemy in 40 odd, low strength wounds, but against anything in heavy armor, you're going to struggle to get past a save of 2+. I wouldn't recommend it, but you could also look at pure strain Genestealers for high amounts of attacks, especially with more than 10 in a group. If the leaks are to be believed, Genestealers might get really cool in the next update, so, that's definitely something to think about. I know it's very tempting to throw a shitload of rock stores at a target which has got a high invuln. I mean, let's face it, they're typically going to be the things that you want to destroy, but you just have to expect the possibility of a surprisingly lucky save roll from your opponent, no matter how many swords you hit them with. This shit happens all the time to me, so sometimes it won't, and you'll grind them into dust. It all depends on the dice gods that day. Number 2, feel no pains. Now, this is a blanket term given to any unit that can ignore wounds they receive. So, for example, we've got it on our Goliath trucks and our Ridge Runners, and they're called Rugged Construction or the Flare Launcher on the Ridge Runner. And the fluff or description about why that unit gets to ignore the wound can be totally varied. It really depends on the faction and what makes sense for them. For our infantry, the Icon Ward can provide a 6-inch aura for it, and also our Abominant and our Aberrants have got their own inbuilt version called Bestial Vigor. Theirs is actually much better, as it can be buffed by the Icon Ward and by stratagems. Now, at the end of the day, the rule is almost always the same in practice, so we just commonly call it feel no pain. What it boils down to is a dice roll made after you fail your armor saving throw. So in the right circumstances, it can be very powerful. So let's say if a single wound model gets hit by a single damage weapon, let's say a Space Marine shoots one of our Acolytes with a bolt gun. When the Acolyte fails his armor save, if he's under the 6-inch aura of the Icon Ward, there's a fair chance you could roll a 6, and then that bolt gun damage is ignored, and the Acolyte lives. However, let's say they shoot him with a heavy bolter, that's 2 flat damage. For the feel no pain, you'd have to roll a dice for each of those 2 pieces of damage, so you need a double 6 to save an Acolyte, which is very unlikely. However, the real power of this ability comes with multi-wound models. So let's say you've got some Space Marines in Gravis armor. They've got 3 wounds each. Let's say they're from the Iron Hands chapter. They get an inbuilt feel no pain ability. So let's say even if they get hit by something that's flat damage 3, let's say, we've got Aberrants with the big power hammers. If they save just one of those parts of the 3 damage with the feel no pain, it means that the next attack hitting them has to finish off the model who managed to just survive in the last bit. So any extra damage coming in that overkills him is just wasted. It doesn't carry over to the next model. So what you'll see in these circumstances is a cascading damage reduction effect, where you put in heavy firepower into a target, but they start tanking a few, and then you're forced to waste some of that awesome firepower on overkilling semi-wounded models. I cannot count the amount of times this situation has really blunted the impact of one of my big assaults. So it's really important, therefore, to know which of your opponent's units have access to it, if it comes from an aura, or, the most difficult to deal with is when they could just drop it onto a squad unexpectedly with a stratagem or something. If that's the case, just be aware they've got it in the back pocket. So what can we do about it? A great tool to use is the Rock Cutters. Now, they've got the ability to outright ignore feel no pains by letting you roll a d6 after all the damage is done, and then you can possibly insta-slay a model. All you've got to do is roll higher than the amount of wounds remaining on that target. I mean, the rock drills are also pretty decent, since the damage you inflict with successive mortals can continue up to 5 times, and you can keep rolling regardless if they feel no pain them. So, I mean, the way that you would usually do that is you just see how many, wounds you can get at the most, and then just your opponent has to feel no pain them all at the end of that. And again, sheer volume of damage 1 attacks are a good solution. If you're hitting high wound models, the benefit here is that you're never going to be wasting damage on overkill. The more rolls your opponent has to make, the more they will fail. On the flip side of the coin, just be aware how awesome our Aberrants are when you really line up the correct buffs. You can get them up to toughness 5 with the Biophagous. They already reduce damage by 1, and then they've got the inbuilt feel no pain of 5. You keep them near the Icon Ward to re-roll 1s on that, and you can also pay 2 CP stratagem to bump it up to a 4+. I think that's monstrous vigor. If you're throwing them into a big brawl, you've got to plan ahead and cast that stratagem in the movement phase. So, if you're planning for that big fight, just really do it at the start. Your opponent will probably be pretty surprised at how hard it is to shift them. Just remember that Feel No Pains are so great because in almost all cases they cannot be fucked with or removed. There are very few exceptions, but the most popular and common one is the Necron Shard of the Nightbringer. This bastard's got a specific ability called Drain Life, which dictates enemies' attacks cannot ignore damage caused using Feel No Pain type stuff. So watch out for him, because he's a nasty fucker. Okay, number 3, damage reduction. Now here's another ability that used to be kind of rare and now is just everywhere. The most common version is, of course, the Death Guard rule, Disgustingly Resilient. The entire faction gets it. Basically, it just reduces damage rolls by 1. So if you hit them with a flat damage 2 weapon like our rock swords or an autocannon, it just becomes 1 damage. Flat damage 3 becomes 2. If you roll a 6 on a d6 mining laser shot, it becomes 5, etc, etc. It does not affect mortal wounds, however. Other places you'll commonly see this is on Dreadnoughts. Their version is called Duty Eternal. Our Aberrants get it as part of Bestial Vigor. A lot of the new Orc stuff gets it, either from being dead tough, or when the Ramshackle vehicles get hit by anything less than Strength 8. The Sisters Paragon Warsuits get it. Sometimes you'll see it come in the form of an aura. For example, the Deathwing Terminators can be buffed by a Warlord trait called Inexorable that does the same thing. So dealing with this ability is pretty simple as long as you position your squads right and you know what you're doing. A lot of our key flat 2 damage weapons are going to suffer from it, like the rock swords, as I mentioned before, the autocannons, the Aberrants when they've got the big smashy improvised weapon, the Locust Blades, the Kelemorph's pistols, the seismic cannons. D3 damage stuff like the Patriarch's Claws are also really effective, but remember you can counter this with the Twisted Helix Warlord trait, which is Bioalchemist. That will give them a +1 damage on those claws, which then flattens out. Now, again, this is where the rock drills come in. Rock drills only deal 1 damage, but then the rest is done via mortals afterwards. So it really makes them worthwhile here, as they don't care about the damage reduction ability. So the same goes for the Cutters, who will still probably get kills after their D3 damage using the insta-slay rule. Again, what you also want to look for is spamming single damage attacks. Lots of Rending Claws, lots of Hand Flamers, stuff like that. They don't give 2 shits about damage reduction. Or you can go the other way and really go to town with heavy mining laser spam. I'm not a fan of this, but everyone else online seems to be. D6 damage just gives you a good chance of rolling high, and then the damage reduction ability is just not enough to withstand it. In theory, 9 Ridge Runners shooting D3 shots each, and they are blast, remember, so a max of 27 shots against larger squads. It's certainly a lot of DACA, so it's food for thought. By now, you might be starting to think that the solution to everything is just lots and lots of damage 1 attacks, and sure, that does solve a lot of problems, but typically those hits are never going to have a strength above 6, so you do always need bigger tools too for dealing with Dreadnoughts, or that crazy new Orc Kill Rig transport, for example. Watch out for that unit because it's stupidly cheap points-wise, very dangerous, and you have to hit it with Strength 8 or above to avoid damage reduction. I mean, in a way, we're actually quite well equipped to deal with Orc's new Ramshackle rule. Rock swords are ideal because they won't be affected by that. Okay, number 4, -1 to hit. A -1 to hit modifier used to be insanely powerful in 8th edition because there was no cap to how many you could stack together. So thankfully that's all a thing of the past. Now you can only suffer 1 penalty to hit at once. For example, if your neophytes with mining lasers are shooting at an opponent that has a -1 to hit ability, you can't also suffer a further penalty for moving and shooting heavy weapons. Now it's most common to see this rule affect shooting, although plenty affect melee too. It's not just jet bikes and fast moving shit that get access to it. You're also likely to see Death Guard cast Miasma of Pestilence in the psychic phase, sometimes on Mortarion himself, or again you could see it in the form of an aura character. The first one that springs to mind is the Custodes Vexillus Praetor Bannerman. So most dedicated flyers also come under the hard to hit rule, so things like Astra Militarum Valkyries and other types of gunships. Now, dealing with enemy flyers is always a big problem for us because our shooting ability is limited and you can't get into melee with them, so be aware. Now, looking at our own codex, the Patriarch can get the Shadow Stalker trait, for example, which applies to all attacks. And then there's the Atalan Jackals get hard to hit rules that only applies to shooting. Now, our ballistic skill is almost always 4+, which is shit. So going up by another 1 to 5+ really does affect our chances of hitting anything at all. But if you're taking my advice, you're probably not running Genestealer Cult as a shooting army anyway. Our real damage comes from acolytes and melee troops who have got, respectable 3+ or higher weapon skill. Either way, we have two characters capable of counteracting hit modifiers by gifting a +1 aura of their own. For the melee, it's the Primus, and for shooting, it's the Jackal Alphas. I can't really say I'm a particularly big fan of the Jackal Alphas, but a lot of other players use her, especially in conjunction with Ridge Runners, lots of mining lasers. Another method of buffering back against hit modifiers are rerolls. For Genestealer Cults, there's a few methods of accessing these, but they're generally locked behind cult creeds that I wouldn't recommend going for. For example, the Hive Cult can get a Warlord trait of reroll 1's aura called Hive Lord, but who the fuck is using Hive Cult? Competitively. Some people do. Say so in the comments if I'm talking to you. I want to know how your theory stacks up in practice. For melee, there's the Pauper Princes. Now, I used to give them a bad press, but I certainly see the advantages now these days, especially after speaking to people like Sandman. They've really shown how that can work. So these guys reroll all failed hits after charging. I used to think that was shit due to only being after charging, but that's all that matters really, because you never tend to survive to a second round brawl if you don't clean house on the first attack anyway. So this is great for aberrants who don't get a cool icon option like the hybrids do. One last hidden gem is the Kelomorph. He can actually give nearby units reroll 1s to hit if he makes some kills first. So all the lads around him see how awesome he is and they get inspired. So this often gets forgotten about because most people drop him in via deep strike at the far end of the board to Swiss cheese an enemy character. What I would say is try doing the opposite. Deploy him on the board, first turn, and jump him into a Goliath truck after it dumps its initial load. So then you push that truck straight up the middle and you have your Kelomorph blazing away out the top. Keeps him safe, gets more value out of his abilities. Note that he can't inspire the trucks, the Ridge Runners or Bikers, so this only applies to neophytes, if they've got mining lasers. Another shitty little caveat to our units and a piss state that he has to actually get a kill first rather than just an aura that's always active. Lastly, let's remember Hand Flamers. This one is obvious. Hand Flamers don't even need to roll to hit, they just do automatically. It's a huge advantage. As a prime example, Craft World Eldari style jet bikes really hate Hand Flamers. They've got a low armor save and you'll be wounding on 5, so I've always had good luck with that trade-off. Number 5, Transhuman Physiology and similar type rules. So there's not really a blanket term for this sort of rule, so I'm just going to call it Transhuman Physiology. It's the most common version you'll come up against. Primaris Space Marines get access to this as a stratagem that they can place on a squad when they get targeted by an attack. It means that they can only be wounded on an unmodified roll of 4+, regardless of any abilities or funky stuff your weapons have got. So for example, the Sanctus Biodagger or the Primus's Toxin Injector Claw always wound on a 2+. Sadly, this rule ignores and overrides those weapons. It's a huge problem for us as cult players, because one thing we actually have in abundance is really high strength melee attacks. All of our rock sword type weapons are ×2 strength, and therefore they're just totally neutered when this situation occurs. The same goes for aberrants who have power hammers, the improvised weapons, or even the heavy mining lasers on your Ridge Runners and stuff like that. If it wasn't for this stratagem, then you'd be wounding your average Marine on a roll of 2+ with those big swords. That's a big sad face. This rule is starting to crop up more and more often, so you need to become familiar with it. One of the nastiest versions is the famous Deathwing Terminators. These Dark Angels heavyweights get a rule called Inner Circle. That means that you can never wound them on anything better than the 4 all the time, which is very nasty, especially when they're already tanky as fuck with invuln saves, storm shields and other buffs. You'll see big gangs of these fighting their way up the midboard and just digging in. It's a nightmare to deal with, and a lot of armies just can't grind them down quick enough. Custodes can also trigger their own version of Transhuman with a stratagem, and we're also going to start seeing it on the new Orcs, the Snake Bites. However, theirs turns off after you start hitting them with Strength 8, so for us, maybe not so scary. So there's a few ways we can deal with this, in theory at least. The first is increase our chances of wounding through rerolls. The Patriarch may always reroll his own fails with the monstrous rending claws, but for the rest of the army, you're going to need to look for buffs, and the most obvious is the Primus. He's got his Meticulous Planner ability, which gives you the chance to reroll 1s against a single key target. You can do this for free, but it can be tricky to line up against hitting that target with the right squads, with him in the right supporting position. Even more so, if the enemy triggers their defensive abilities through a stratagem, you might not know who's going to use it. The better version of this comes in the form of a Warlord trait, the Bladed Cog's Single-Minded Obsession, which gives full rerolls to wound. So that's not bad at all. It would be nice if we didn't have to focus it on a single target though, but you can also give yourself a second meticulous planner thingy with a stratagem. So if you're mixing this with a warlord trait, you could have up to 3 targets you've got rerolls against. Originally, my thoughts led me to believe that the best counter to this problem would be Twisted Helix and their +1 to wound psychic power, which is mutagenic deviation. Now, sadly, after fighting Deathwing a few weeks back, I realised that it doesn't really help. My thinking would be that it would make wound rolls of 3 bump up to 4. However, the defensive ability states that its unmodified rolls of 1, 2, and 3 always fail. So it doesn't do us any favours, apart from making Rending Claws do more AP 4 on rolls of 5 also. So it's better than nothing, and it will really help against Terminators, but it's not going to get you more wounds. Ultimately, this leads us back to our favoured tactic from earlier on in the video, volume of attacks. So just back to the tried and tested, trusty Rending Claws. Basically, you just want to be hitting with weapons that would be probably wounding on a 4+ or a 3+ anyway, but just loads of them. In an ideal world, this will be the reason why we chose pure strain Genestealers, but until they're dropped in points or made more worthwhile, then I'd still go Acolytes or Metamorphs. Soften up your target with Hand Flamers first, and that's probably the best shot you'll get. I mean, you could still throw the big saws and drills at these targets, but you need to know that your success ratio is literally balancing on a 50-50 roll. That can very easily go embarrassingly wrong at a time where you need so much more. Remember, our units can't take a punch back, so if you flop it, then those Deathwing Terminators are literally going to turn around and stomp you into the dirt. They're one opposing force that you will face off a lot against at tournaments, being very popular and very competitive right now, but that means you can plan for it. Okay, number 6, damage limit per phase. Now this one is actually pretty rare to come up against, but it can be very powerful, especially against certain armies. Personally, I've never had an issue dealing with it. For others, it's a nightmare. Basically, this rule states that the character can only take a certain amount of wounds per phase. So once you hit that limit, any further damage done is just wasted and void. It exists to prevent legendary big boys such as the Orc War Boss Ghazghkull Thraka from being tabled in a single turn by excessive firepower. You can only take 4 wounds per phase, and he starts on 12. So in theory, you'd need to do 4 wounds in the psychic phase, 4 wounds with shooting, and 4 wounds in melee to wipe him out in one go. You'll also see this predominantly on the Necron Catan shards. These pop up very regularly, especially the Nightbringer, who we mentioned earlier. I've come up against it also on a Khorne Bloodthirster recently, and there's probably Warlord traits and so forth elsewhere in the game that can grant it to other units. So drop them in the comments if you know any that I can't think of. Now, it doesn't take a genius to see how you've got to work around this. Starting with the psychic phase, you should be looking to use targeted powers like Mental Onslaught to start the ball rolling. We also have Psionic Blast, but I'm not really a fan of that. Smite's the good old tried and tested one, but chances are you're probably going to struggle to line up a Smite, as the target that you're going for won't be the closest. They'll probably be hidden behind something. One thing you could also try doing is a bit of mind control. So you take over an enemy gunline unit and then turn it on the character. It might work and the damage will be valid even though it was done with shooting weapons because it was still the psychic phase. Now, luckily, these types of characters are too big to benefit from Lookout Sir usually, so line of sight permitting, in the shooting phase you can hurl all of your autocannons and shit like that at them until you just chip enough wounds off. When it comes to the fighting phase, this is the easy bit for us. I'm not going to retread old ground, but it's not too difficult to chip off 3 or 4 wounds with drills and saws and whatever you want. Just be aware that if you don't get these sorts of characters killed in one turn, chances are they're going to become more and more annoying to shift as the game goes on. The Catan shards regenerate lives, so it's a bit of a piss take. If you get the chance, take it. Some food for thought before we move on. Remember that the cult stratagem, a perfect ambush, gives us the opportunity to shoot in the movement phase, either when coming in from deep strike or when popping up from a red blip. That gives us an extra window of opportunity to chip wounds off these fuckers outside of the usual 3 damage dealing phases. Remember that you can do this in your opponent's first movement phase when you reveal from the blips, not just in your own turn. It costs 3 CP, but if you're really worried about something, it might be worth it. In the case of the Sanctus, he gets to do this for free, so a cheeky sniper rifle shot isn't a terrible bet either. For armies like the Tau or any others who lack ability in the psychic phase, you can see why we're actually not too badly suited for tackling this problem. Number 7, drones and bodyguards. Now, you've all heard me go on about unquestioning loyalty and how it's one of the coolest rules we've got in the Genestealer cult, so you should be well aware of how annoying this sort of thing can be for your opponent. Let's just hope that unquestioning loyalty doesn't disappear in the new codex. Now, there's actually quite a lot of these new bodyguard rules around, and they've all got their own unique take on it, but it all boils down to the same thing. It forces you to chew through tough bodyguard units before you can get to something that you really want to kill. Now, the Tau used to be the famous ones for this with the shield drones, but they've since been nerfed and they're nowhere as strong as they used to be. The main difference is that some stuff works like our loyalty rolls, allowing them to shun wounds off onto the bodyguards, and some rules just flat out prevent you from even targeting the key unit whilst those bodyguards are near, like a super lookout, so you can't get around with sniper rifles or other trickery. Now, some examples that spring to mind: Tyranids have the Tyrant Guard, Deathwing get the Company Command Terminators, Astra Militarum get the Ogrim Bodyguards, Sisters of Battle get the Gemini Superiors, the Necron Silent King gets his defensive pylon generator things. There's probably loads that I'm forgetting. The truth is, there's actually not a great deal of ways you can get around this. You've either just got to eat the shit sandwich and try to take out the bodyguards, or in some cases, you can still use psychic powers to inflict damage that way. It depends on the rule itself. I mean, often it's easier to just go, okay, fuck that target, whatever it is. I'll just focus on something else and not waste my time on the bodyguard unit, because typically they're pretty tough as well, and they're designed to absorb your attacks in annoyingly efficient ways. So if you've got any better advice for dealing with these, throw them down in the comments. One of the things that keeps popping up at tournaments I've seen recently is that people will put the character that they're trying to protect out in the open, but then the bodyguards are behind cover and out of line of sight, but still keeping them, unavailable to be targeted. So unless you've got ignore line of sight weapons like, mortars, or let's say for us, Hive Guard, if you bring in a Tyranid troll, you can't ever really kill those guys unless you get around the cover, So watch out for that, because it's a right piss take. All I'm going to say as well, if you don't understand unquestioning loyalty a lot, go watch my video on that, because, there's so many cool things we can do for it, and it keeps our guys alive in, equally annoying ways for our opponents. Now, I think that pretty much wraps up all of the major defensive rules you come across. There's, others that I thought of, but they kind of come under the category of tricks and shenanigans to watch out for. If you think there's anything I've blindly forgotten about, let me know and we'll discuss it in the comments. And I'll see you guys soon.